So we are talking about congruent segments and angles. So the question asks us, the first one says, in your own words, what do you think it means for segments and angles to be congruent? Well, in math, the word congruent means the same. It means that they're equal. So if segments are congruent to each other, or angles are congruent to each other, that means they have the same measure. They have the same measure. So it says that congruent segments, so congruent line segments, have the same length, and congruent angles have the same measure. They have the same degree. The symbol for congruent is kind of like the equal sign. So it's equal, and then it has a squiggle line above it. So I know you don't have these two triangles drawn on your paper. They're actually in the Apex notes. So if you'll go ahead and draw them out, and we're going to talk about the congruent statements for these segments and angles as well, using proper notation. So if I have these two triangles that I've drawn, and I'm telling you that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Well, what I know then is that side AB is congruent to side DE. Side BC is congruent to side EF. And I also know that side CA, or AC, the way, is congruent to side FD. And then for my angles, I know that angle BAC is congruent to angle EDF. I know that angle ACDB is congruent to angle DFE. And I know that the angle CBA is congruent to angle FED. So we're supposed to explain the difference between equal and congruent. Well, if two things are equal, that means that they are the same object. So equal, if things are equal, that means they're the same object. If they're congruent, that means that they have the same measure. So they could be two different objects, they just have the same measure. So the midpoint theorem says that the point M is a midpoint. So point M is a midpoint if AM is congruent to BM. So that's saying if I had a line segment with points at A and B, the only way that M can be the midpoint is if AM, this segment on the left, is congruent to BM, the segment on the right. If those two segments aren't congruent, then it's not the midpoint, because the midpoint by definition is the one in the middle. So the same thing is true for the angle bisector theorem, which says that ray VM is an angle bisector if and only if AVM is congruent to BVM. So that's saying if you had an angle like this, and this was A, and this was V, and this was B, and then I had in here segment VM, ray VM. The only way that that can be the angle bisector, remember bisector means to split in half, okay, is if this left top part is equal to that bottom part. That's the only way it can be the angle bisector. In general, two geometric objects are congruent if you can move one and place it on top of the other, and they are identical. That's the only way two things can be congruent. So for number 1 on the checkup, it says point C is the midpoint of AB. What segment is congruent to AC? So what we're told by that is that we have this line segment, AC. And we know that C is the midpoint. If C is the midpoint, that means it's in the middle. And what it does is it means that this half on the left is equal to the half on the right. So it says what is congruent to AC. So AC is this part. Well, it must be congruent to BC because BC is the other half. Number 3, point Y is the midpoint of XZ. So let's start with there. Y is the midpoint. So Y splits all of XZ in half. So this is half and this is half. And you don't have to write that, but that's what it's done. So we know that whatever XY is equal to whatever YZ is. That's the definition of midpoint. It also tells us that point W is the midpoint of XY. So this W splits this part in half, so this part and this part are equal. And the last thing they tell us is that XW equals 3, so this part's 3. Well, if we know XW is equal to WY, then WY is also 3, which makes the entire XY 6. If XY is 6, then YZ is 6, because XY and YZ are equal because Y was the midpoint. Number 5 says to name all the congruent segments in the picture below. So let's see. Well, if I'm looking at these numbers, I have 3, 4, 6, and 1. None of those numbers themselves are congruent, but if I start adding some things together, 3 plus 4 gives me 7, and 6 plus 1 gives me 7. So that means that the segment AC is congruent to the segment CE because they were both 7. If I tried adding any other numbers like 3, 4, and 6, then nothing else is going to be equal. So I'm just going to move on because I don't know other line segments that are congruent. So 7 says that YW bisects angle XYZ. So I'm going to draw a picture. So here's angle XYZ. And we know that YW, so here's W, bisects it. Remember, bisect means split in half. Okay, and half means that there's 2 equal parts. So if XYW, that's the angle made connecting X to Y to W, is 47, what is WYZ? Well, WYZ would be the part made connecting W to Y to Z. Well, remember, if YW is the bisector, then what it does is it splits it in half. So if the top part is 47, then the bottom part must also be 47. So my answer would be 47 degrees. Number 9 says if a 90-degree angle is bisected, so let's draw a picture. 90-degree angle means it's a right angle. So it's bisected means it's split in half. So if I bisect a 90-degree angle, well, that means that the top part is 45 and the bottom part is also 45. And then each new angle is also bisected, so they're bisected again. So I'm splitting that 45-degree part into half. then what is the measure of the smallest angle formed? Well, if I split 45 into half, then each half is 22.5. So the smallest angle formed is 22.5 degrees.